If you asked me to put together a list of exciting stock picks for a new year, I would normally resist the whole exercise. I have spent too much of my life telling people not to turn investing into a prediction contest. The market is not there to flatter your ability to sound bold in January and look clever in December. It is there to transfer money from the impatient to the patient, from the emotional to the disciplined, and from those who worship stories to those who insist on economics. That has always been my view. Still, if you forced me to do it, if you told me that I had to sit down at the beginning of 2026 and identify the handful of growth businesses that most deserve long-term attention, I would not begin with the chart, the hype, or the crowd. I would begin with one much simpler question: where is the world being forced to spend money, whether it wants to or not? That is usually where the best opportunities hide. The crowd likes romance. I like necessity. The crowd likes novelty. I like bottlenecks. The crowd likes what sounds futuristic. I like what the future cannot be built without. That difference matters. A lot of investors make a terrible mistake with growth. They think growth is a category. It is not. Growth is a consequence. A company grows because it is sitting at the right point inside an economic system that is expanding, consolidating, or becoming more valuable per unit of demand. That is what I care about. I do not care whether the product sounds glamorous. I care whether the economics are strengthening. I do not care whether the founder gives a great interview. I care whether the company can turn revenue into free cash flow while the rest of the field is still trying to explain itself. I do not care whether a stock was exciting last quarter. I care whether the next 5 or 10 years still have enough runway, that today's valuation can eventually be absorbed by actual operating performance. That is the way I would approach a group of 2026 growth names. I would start with the infrastructure of artificial intelligence and modern compute, because that is where an enormous amount of spending is now being concentrated. But I would not buy whatever happens to be making the loudest noise. I would ask where the real choke points are. And if I look honestly, I see at least 4 of them: networking power and capacity, manufacturing equipment, and the compute platform itself. That is why the first company I would want to own in a basket like this is Arista Networks. People love to talk about chips because chips are cinematic. They like to say the GPU is the pickaxe of the new gold rush. Fine, that is partially true. But an AI cluster full of expensive chips that cannot communicate efficiently is a very expensive sculpture. The system only works when the networking fabric allows enormous amounts of data to move cleanly, quickly, and at scale. That is where Arista lives. I like that position very much. The best businesses often sit in places that are indispensable but less emotionally celebrated than the shiny end product. Arista built itself into exactly that kind of role. When I look at a business like this, the first thing I want to see is not just revenue growth. I want to see whether profitability is scaling with it. A lot of businesses can grow revenue if they are willing to buy it. The far better test is whether each new dollar of revenue becomes more valuable than the last. Arista passes that test beautifully. Over the last several years, revenue expanded from roughly $2 billion into the high single-digit billions, and margins widened in a way that tells me this is not just a cyclical burst. This is a company with real operating leverage that matters. The free cash flow profile matters even more. You can tell a lot about the quality of a business by how much capital it must keep spending just to stand still. Arista does not look like a desperate industrial treadmill. It looks like a company with a strong product position, a rational cost structure, and the kind of balance sheet that lets management act from strength rather than from financing pressure. That is exactly what I want. And then I ask the broader question, is the demand real? In this case, yes, as AI workloads scale, networking stops being a supporting detail and becomes a central constraint. The bigger the cluster, the more painful bad networking becomes. That is a wonderful place to be if you are the company supplying the solution. Now, I would not call Arista a cheap stock in the old-fashioned cigar. But since that is not the point here, I am not hunting for discarded trash. I am hunting for businesses that can grow into today's price because the economic position is that strong. That is a very different game. The second name I would study closely is Applied Digital. This one sits at a very different place in the same broad system. Arista helps the compute clusters communicate. Applied Digital is trying to build the physical environments those clusters need in order to exist at all. And that brings me to something the public still underestimates badly. AI is not just a software story. It is a power story, it is a real estate story, it is an infrastructure story, it is a cooling story, it is a capital intensity story. The future always sounds weightless in public, but when serious demand arrives, it becomes extremely physical. Someone needs the land, someone needs the substations, someone needs the electricity at a price that still allows the economics to make sense. That is why Applied Digital is interesting. The company is not trying to win by having the coolest narrative. It is trying to win by getting control of cheap, durable power and pairing that with long-term capacity in a world starved for both. That is a better place to compete. I like businesses where the customer cares less about the logo and more about whether the underlying capacity actually exists. This is especially true in an environment where hyperscalers cannot wait forever and where electricity constraints have started to shape the real geography of growth. If a firm can secure power, rich regions early and lock in attractive economics before shortages become universal, that can become extremely valuable later. Now, this is not a mature fortress the way Arista looks like one. That matters too. Applied Digital still has more execution risk. Its margins have been under pressure during the build-out phase. That is normal enough for this kind of business, but it means I would frame it correctly. This is not a polished compounding machine yet. It is a capacity build story with a very large possible payoff if management executes. I can live with that when the asymmetry is attractive, but I do not confuse it with a more proven operator. That is how adults should think about speculative growth. Not all growth names are equally mature, and pretending otherwise is how portfolios get wounded. Still, if management can bring the planned campuses online, and if the leased economics mature the way they are supposed to, there is a world where this company becomes much more important than the current revenue base suggests. That is enough to keep me interested. The third name belongs to a very different category, but it fits the same broader 2026 reality, AeroVironment. Most people still think of it as a drone company. That is too small a frame. The world has entered a period where low-cost autonomous systems, loitering munitions, counter-drone defense, and the broader software. Sensor stack around them are no longer theoretical. They are operational realities that changes the economics of defense in a very significant way. And when the economics of defense change, the companies already embedded in those systems can find themselves in a very attractive position. What I like here is not merely the product line. It is the layering AeroVironment started in a niche. Yes, but it is building towards something larger, a broader defense technology platform, where drones remain central, but where the adjacent systems matter too. The Blue Halo acquisition is a major part of that story. It changed the revenue profile dramatically and made the company look almost discontinuous if you compare the quarterly figures too simplistically. That is why I always dislike shallow chart reading around acquisitions. A jump in revenue after a big acquisition is not impressive by itself. What matters is whether the combination creates a better business than either piece standing alone. That is the question here. What I want to see over the next stage is integration discipline. I want to see whether management can stabilize margins, keep backlog quality high, and turn defense demand into something more durable than episodic military enthusiasm. Backlog helps a lot. In businesses like this, backlog is a form of visibility. It does not guarantee the whole future, but it tells you that customers are not merely curious. They are committed enough to write contracts. The Switchblade line matters because it proved the company could become operationally relevant in modern conflict, not merely technically interesting. That distinction is huge. A lot of defense technologies are wonderful in press releases and disappointing in actual deployment. Once a system proves itself in real conditions, the economic conversation changes. That is where AeroVironment has an advantage. Would I pay anything for it? Of course not. Nothing is worth any price. But I do think this is the kind of company that can look one-dimensional to the public while actually becoming structurally broader underneath. That is often where mispricing lies. Then we come to a much more speculative but still fascinating case. IonQ. Now, if a person hears me mention quantum computing and immediately assumes I have lost my discipline, I understand the reaction. Quantum has been one of those words that attracts more mythology than revenue for a very long time. And mythology is not an asset class. What interests me here is not the word quantum by itself. It is whether a company is beginning to move from laboratory romance into commercial evidence. That is a much narrower and much more serious question. IonQ is still early. I want to be very clear about that. This is not Coca-Cola. This is not American Express. This is not CS Candies. This is an emerging platform bet where the payoff depends on a technology crossing from scientific promise into economically relevant use. That is a high bar. But what catches my attention is the shift from a pure proof of concept story into a business that is at least starting to produce meaningful revenue jumps and commercial embeddings. The revenue profile has begun to look less like research support and more like the first signs of an operating model. Not a mature one, a real one that matters. Technical leadership matters too. I do not pretend to know everything about every quantum architecture, and this is exactly where the circle of competence must remain honest. But within that honesty, I can still notice when a company is producing metrics that suggest it is closer to practical error correction and useful workloads than the field once thought. If that is true, then the economics later could be much larger than the present income statement implies. Now, should a normal investor build his life around this? Number that would be foolish. A company like IonQ belongs in the category of limited exposure, high upside, meaningful uncertainty. I respect that profile when it is sized appropriately. I do not worship it. In a basket of 2026 growth names, it deserves a place as an option on a technology platform becoming economically relevant, but it should never be confused with the more obvious, already profitable infrastructure leaders. That difference in maturity must remain clear. Which leads naturally to NVIDIA. People get uncomfortable when a stock becomes too obvious. They assume that once everyone sees it, the opportunity must be gone. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes a company is so central to a regime change that even after enormous gains, the runway is still longer than the public can emotionally process. NVIDIA may be in that category. I do not say that casually. The reason I take NVIDIA seriously is that it is no longer simply a chip company in the old sense. It is a systems company, it is a software company, it is a platform company, it is a company that increasingly sells full stack compute solutions into one of the largest capital spending waves of modern technology. That is different. The public still argues about whether the valuation is high. I understand the instinct. Valuation matters. It always matters. But the mistake many people make is that they look at a giant market cap and conclude the whole story must be mature. That is not always correct. What matters is how much of the world's compute infrastructure still has to be rebuilt to match the new demands of AI training, post-training, and inference. If that rebuild is still in the early innings, then the companies selling the central platform may still have a lot of economics left to harvest. I like the data center mix. I like the software layer. I like the fact that customers are no longer simply buying isolated components, but increasingly treating NVIDIA as the organizing architecture around the whole build. That is a very powerful place to be whenever a business moves from being a supplier to being the standard by which the system is organized. The economics can become very attractive for a very long time. Now, does that mean there are no risks? Of course not. Concentration risk exists. CapEx cycles can cool. Customers can diversify over time. Competition can improve. Governments can interfere. All of that is real. But if I step back and ask what the next several years of large-scale compute modernization are likely to require, NVIDIA still sits at the center of the answer. That is enough to keep it on the list. The next name is one most ordinary people ignore because it is one step removed from the thing they think they understand. Lam Research. I have always liked businesses that sell the tools needed to build the future more than businesses that simply participate in the fashion of the future. Toolmakers have a wonderful place in capitalism when the demand wave is broad enough. The shovel seller often sleeps better than the gold dreamer. Lam sits in the semiconductor manufacturing chain in a way that matters more as chips become harder to build, not easier. That is the kind of structural position I like. The complexity of advanced manufacturing is not declining, it is increasing. As memory architectures get more sophisticated, as HBM demand expands, as etch intensity rises, as process steps multiply, the relevance of a company like Lam becomes more durable. That is not a one-quarter story, it is a capability story. Capability stories are stronger than fashion stories. What also interests me here is that Lam has already shown it can scale profitably. Revenue has grown enormously over the long arc, yet the important thing is not only the top line, it is that operating economics improved with it. That tells me the firm is not merely lucky to be in the right market. It is exploiting its position rationally. The cycle is always a concern in semicap. I do not ignore that. But the cycle profile itself seems to have improved relative to older eras. If the drawdowns are becoming shallower while the upside remains substantial, that is exactly the sort of evolution I like to see in a tool supplier. It means the business is becoming better, not merely larger. And then there is the HBM angle. Whenever an industry shift increases process complexity and the incumbent equipment provider captures more content per unit, I become interested. More content per chip can be a very beautiful thing if the overall demand wave is still expanding. That is why Lam deserves a seat in this conversation. Then comes Amazon. And this one is particularly interesting because, unlike the others, it does not tell its story in a straight line. Amazon has always been a strange stock in the sense that it often runs hard, then seems to do nothing for years while the business catches up to the earlier enthusiasm. That can be frustrating for people who need constant validation. It can be very useful for people who understand what the pauses often represent. A stock that goes sideways while the economics quietly improve is often becoming more attractive, not less. That appears to be what happened here. Amazon is not a mystery. The market knows AWS. The market knows the retail engine. The market knows the advertising business. The market knows the logistics footprint. What the market often misjudges is when the internal economics are about to shift again after a long period of digestion. That is where I think Amazon becomes interesting. Now, AWS appears to be strengthening again. Operating income has expanded sharply. Free cash flow has recovered in a meaningful way. The company is investing from a stronger base rather than from stress that matters. A business funding its next chapter with internally generated strength is in a much better place than one that must constantly ask the capital markets for patience. Amazon can still be difficult for people because it does not always pay off on their schedule. Good. The market's need for constant gratification is one of the reasons opportunities remain available in businesses like this. A stock that sits while the public grows bored can become attractive precisely because boredom reduces the emotional premium. If AWS continues reaccelerating and the company keeps translating its scale into stronger profitability, then a long, quiet stretch can become the setup rather than the disappointment. I have always liked that kind of pattern more than the obvious breakout everyone already celebrates. And finally, AMD. This is another name where I think the market may be underestimating the degree to which the business has changed. A lot of people still carry an older mental picture of AMD that is common in markets. A company evolves, and the public's narrative about it lags the actual economics by years. AMD is not a turnaround story in the old sense anymore. It is a scaled semiconductor company with meaningful data center exposure, improving cash generation, and a much more diversified profile than the lazy story still suggests. What attracts me here is the mismatch between what the numbers imply and what the valuation seems to be assuming. If growth is still very healthy, if the data center business is becoming the profit driver, if the free cash flow picture is getting better, and if the earnings optics are being distorted by non-cash acquisition amortization, then the stock can look more expensive or less polished than the underlying business truly is. That is where opportunity can live. I am always interested when the income statement story and the economic reality begin separating in a way the market has not fully reconciled. Customers buying rack-scale AI systems rather than isolated chips also changes the future economics meaningfully. That is another example of a business broadening its relevance. A company that moves from component provider toward system level participation often becomes more important to the customer and captures more economics in the process. That is attractive. Would I call AMD the same kind of fortress as Arista or Nvidia number? But I do think it belongs in the basket because the market may still be treating it like a weaker story than the current facts justify. Now, if you step back from the names, a pattern appears. These are not random stock picks. They are not just whatever sounds futuristic in 2026. They are mostly pieces of one enormous spending map. The world is rebuilding compute. It is electrifying the support systems around compute. It is upgrading networking capacity, semiconductor tools, and defense technologies with more autonomy and more software. And in a few cases, it is beginning to test the next frontier beyond classical compute. That is the real shape underneath the list. I always prefer finding the shape beneath the list. The list by itself is trivia. The shape is the investment case. That is also why I would be careful with size and temperament here. A basket like this is not a substitute for discipline. It is not a reason to forget valuation. It is not an excuse to stop owning broad market exposure. And it certainly is not permission to turn a portfolio into a shrine for whatever happened to work recently. I have no interest in worship. I am interested in where the economics are likely to remain powerful. If I had to rank the group by quality of business and clarity of economics, the ordering would be different than if I ranked them by raw upside potential. That is normal. Arista and Nvidia feel more proven. Lam has a beautiful tool position. Amazon has the strange advantage of boredom after a long digestion period. AMD feels like a mismatch opportunity where the numbers and the story still have not fully converged. AeroVironment carries platform. Building potential in a defense world that is changing quickly. Applied Digital offers more raw infrastructure upside with more execution risk. IonQ is the option, like Outlier, the one that could become far more important if the technical and commercial crossover keeps accelerating, but which should be sized with real humility. That is how I would actually think about it, not as a pile of tickers, as a set of economic roles with different maturity levels, different risk structures, and different paths to success. This is where a lot of investors go wrong. They buy 8 names and think they diversified. They bought 8 stories and never asked whether the stories all depend on the same spending wave, the same rate environment, the same market mood, or the same assumptions about capital availability. Real diversification is economic, not merely numeric. That said, there are times when thematic concentration makes sense if you are being honest about what you are doing. If you understand that you are leaning heavily into one broad multi-year regime change, then fine. Own that consciously, just do not flatter yourself by calling it balanced when it clearly is not. There is one more thing I would add before I leave these names. I would never let an annual stock picking exercise change the deeper rules that have always governed good investing. I still want a margin between price and probable value. I still want a balance sheet that can survive disappointment. I still want management that allocates capital rationally instead of treating growth as a religion. I still want a business strong enough that time is an ally, that matters especially in growth investing, where so many people confuse excitement with inevitability. Excitement is not inevitability. Demand does not automatically become durable economics. A good product does not automatically become a great stock. A high-growth industry does not automatically make every participant a wise long-term holding. That is why I keep coming back to the same framework. What is the bottleneck who gets paid regardless of which sub-story wins, who has the balance sheet to survive a pause, who has the margins to convert scale into cash, who is moving from vendor to platform, who is gaining share because the task itself is getting harder? Those questions lead me back to the same group, and if I had to step into 2026 with a small basket of growth businesses, these are where I would begin. Not because these names are guaranteed. Nothing is, because the world appears to be forcing capital toward the systems they help build, and businesses positioned at forced spending bottlenecks often become very good places to stand. That is the sort of opportunity I have always preferred, quietly inevitable, economically strong, and likely to look even more obvious later than it feels right now.